You showed me what real love looks like, Layla Thompson whispered, her voice trembling as Orion Whitmore, the billionaire whose world she'd entered only hours ago, pressed a $200,000 check into her trembling hands. A lifeline to save her mother's life without sacrificing her innocence. In that charged moment, the cold of the hospital dissolved, and two souls from vastly different worlds stood on the edge of a life-altering choice. Where are you listening from today? Drop your location in the comments and share what you think will happen next. Will love triumph over wealth, or will hidden motives unravel their bond? This story of sacrifice, transformation, and unexpected connection will keep you guessing. Subscribe now to catch our latest videos and join the journey, because tomorrow's tale is just as gripping, and you won't want to miss it. The penthouse boardroom of Orion Enterprises was a cathedral of wealth, its glass walls framing Singapore's skyline like a painting of ambition. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, glinting off polished chrome and rosewood, casting the room in a sterile glow that felt both commanding and cold. Orion Whitmore stood at the edge of this opulence, his navy suit tailored to his tall, lean frame, its crisp lines accentuating the power he'd spent 2 decades building. At 39, his sandy blonde hair was impeccably styled, but his green eyes, sharp as cut jade, flickered with a restlessness that no amount of money could quiet. 3 failed marriages had left him hollow, each ex-wife more enamored with his bank account than the idea of a family. Now the ticking of his mortality, a faint, persistent drumbeat in his chest, had driven him to this moment, the search for a surrogate to carry the heir his empire demanded. Orion's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, sat at the rosewood conference table, her cream silk dress a study in understated elegance. At 70, her silver hair was swept into a chignon, her posture rigid with the authority of a woman who had navigated boardrooms and gala dinners with equal precision. She flipped through a dossier from the surrogacy agency, her voice crisp as she spoke. "She's due any moment, Orion. The agency assures me she meets every requirement. Health, background, psychological stability." Her words were clinical, a checklist for a transaction. Orion turned from the window, his jaw tightening. "Requirements?" he echoed, the word bitter on his tongue. "As if we're selecting a product, not a person to carry my child." Eleanor's lips thinned, her eyes narrowing. "This is a transaction, Orion, a means to secure your legacy. Sentiment won't build an heir." But Orion wasn't so sure. His empire, built on cold calculation, had given him everything, except the one thing he craved, a legacy that meant more than stock portfolios and skyscrapers. The air in the room seemed to hum with tension, the kind that precedes a storm. Orion's gaze drifted to the city below, a sprawl of glass and steel that stretched toward the horizon. He'd conquered markets, outmaneuvered rivals, but this decision felt different, heavier. It wasn't just about an heir. It was about confronting the emptiness that wealth couldn't fill. Eleanor's voice cut through his thoughts. "You've wanted this for years. Don't let emotion cloud your judgment now." He didn't respond, his fingers brushing the smooth edge of his cufflinks, a nervous habit he'd never admit to. The truth was, he didn't know what he felt. Only that this moment, this choice, carried a weight he couldn't shake. A soft knock at the door snapped him back to the present. "Come in," he called, his voice steady despite the churn in his gut. The heavy glass door swung open, and Layla Thompson stepped into the room. She was nothing like what he'd expected. At 25, her rich ebony skin seemed to absorb the light, giving her a quiet radiance that stood in stark contrast to the room's cold grandeur. Her long hair was braided neatly down her back, and she wore an emerald blazer that was slightly too large, its sleeves frayed at the edges, a second-hand garment that spoke of struggle rather than style. Yet it was her presence that struck him most. Despite the exhaustion in her dark eyes, despite the nervous way her fingers twisted together, she carried herself with a dignity that seemed to defy her circumstances. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, as if she refused to let the weight of the world bend her. "Miss Thompson," Eleanor said, rising with a smile honed by decades of charity galas and boardroom negotiations. "Please, have a seat." Layla nodded, her voice soft but clear. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." She crossed the room with a grace that seemed almost out of place, like a wildflower blooming through concrete. As she settled into the leather chair across from them, her gaze flickered to Orion. For a moment their eyes locked, and he felt an unexpected jolt, a spark of something raw, unguarded. Vulnerability, yes, but also resolve, a quiet strength that made the room feel smaller, more human. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, extending her hand. Her grip was firm, her palms soft but calloused, the hands of someone who knew work, who knew struggle. "Layla," he replied, the name slipping out before he could stop it. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, but enough to soften the tension in her face. Eleanor wasted no time, her tone all business. "I trust the agency explained the arrangement. Mr. Whitmore requires a gestational surrogate. The compensation is substantial, $500,000, plus all medical expenses and a living allowance during the pregnancy." Layla's eyes widened briefly at the figure, a flicker of shock betraying her composure before she schooled her features. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "They explained everything." Orion studied her, searching for the artifice he'd grown accustomed to in his world, the calculated glances, the polished lies. But Layla's face held only honesty, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of battles fought long before she'd stepped into this room. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice softer than he intended, "may I ask why you're considering this? Surrogacy isn't a decision most make lightly." For the first time, her composure cracked. Her jaw tightened, her fingers pressing together until her knuckles paled. She took a breath, as if steeling herself, and when she spoke, her words were a quiet confession. "My mother, Grace, has stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of the truth. "The experimental treatment that could save her costs more than I could earn in 10 years. Insurance doesn't cover it." The words landed like a physical blow, cutting through the sterile air of the boardroom. Orion's breath caught, his carefully constructed world of profit and loss suddenly feeling small, inadequate. Here was a woman who wasn't chasing luxury or status. She was fighting for survival, for love. Eleanor, unfazed, consulted her notes. "Your medical history is impeccable. No substance abuse, no genetic concerns. The psychological evaluation was favorable." Layla nodded. The agency was thorough. But Orion barely heard them. His mind was fixed on Layla's words, on the quiet courage in her eyes. This wasn't just a transaction. This was a woman offering up her body, her future, to save the person she loved most. And he, with all his billions, stood on the verge of exploiting that desperation. The thought twisted in his gut, sharp and unfamiliar, as the room fell silent, the weight of Layla's sacrifice hanging between them like a storm about to break. The boardroom of Orion Enterprises seemed to contract, its opulent sheen fading as Layla Thompson's words hung in the air like a confession too heavy for the polished rosewood table to bear. Her admission that she was offering her body as a surrogate to fund her mother's cancer treatment had pierced the sterile atmosphere, leaving Orion Whitmore reeling. The billionaire stood motionless, his green eyes fixed on Layla, whose rich ebony skin caught the sunlight streaming through the glass walls. Her worn emerald blazer and the quiet strength in her posture made her seem both fragile and unbreakable, a paradox that tugged at something deep within him. Eleanor Whitmore, seated with the poise of a seasoned matriarch, broke the silence, her voice clipped and professional. "Miss Thompson, your medical history is exemplary. No substance abuse, no genetic markers for hereditary diseases. Your psychological evaluation is favorable." She flipped through the agency's dossier, her silver hair glinting under the fluorescent lights. "The agency was thorough, as you said." Layla nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "Yes, ma'am. They explained everything." Her hands, folded tightly in her lap, betrayed a faint tremor, a crack in the dignity she wore like armor. Orion watched her, his mind racing. The compensation, $500,000 plus medical and living expenses, was a fortune to most, but to him it was a fraction of a quarterly dividend. Yet for Layla, it was the difference between life and death for her mother, Grace. The weight of that truth settled over him, heavy and unyielding, stirring a discomfort he couldn't name. He leaned forward, his tailored suit shifting against his broad shoulders, and spoke, his tone gentler than the boardroom's stark edges. "Miss Thompson, why surrogacy? It's not a choice most make lightly." The question wasn't just curiosity, it was a probe, a need to understand the woman who sat before him, offering so much for so little in return. Layla's composure faltered, her dark eyes flickering with something raw, pain perhaps, or resolve. Her fingers pressed together until her knuckles paled, and she took a breath as if gathering the strength to lay her soul bare. "My mother, Grace, has stage 4 pancreatic cancer," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "The experimental treatment that could save her costs more than I'll ever earn. Insurance doesn't cover it, and I've already sold everything I could. This is my last option." The words struck Orion like a physical blow, his breath catching in his throat. Here was no calculated play for wealth or status, no artifice he'd grown accustomed to in his world of high-stakes deals and fleeting alliances. Layla's honesty was a blade, cutting through the veneer of his carefully constructed life. She wasn't here for luxury. She was here for love, for survival. Eleanor, unfazed, continued her clinical review, her pen tapping lightly against the dossier. "Your medical records show you've never been pregnant, which is ideal for a first-time surrogate. But," she paused, her sharp eyes narrowing as she read further, "this is unusual. According to the physician's notes, you've never been sexually active." The statement landed like a thunderclap, the air in the room thickening with its implications. Layla's cheeks flushed, a deep crimson creeping up her neck, but she lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "Yes," she said simply. "Is that a problem?" The question was direct, almost defiant, and Orion felt the world tilt beneath him. A virgin. At 25, she was offering not just her body, but a piece of herself she'd guarded fiercely, a gift she'd never shared. His stomach churned, a cold sickness rising at the thought of what they were asking her to sacrifice. "You've never," Orion began, then stopped, his voice rougher than he intended. The words felt intrusive, yet he couldn't stop himself. "You've never been with anyone?" Layla's eyes met his, steady and unapologetic. "No," she said, her voice carrying a quiet pride. "I've been focused on other things. My mother, work, keeping us afloat. I never met anyone worth that gift." The word gift echoed in Orion's mind, reverberating like a bell in a silent cathedral. A gift, not a transaction, not a commodity, but something sacred, something she'd protected through years of hardship. And here she sat, prepared to surrender it to save her mother's life. The realization twisted in his gut, sharp and unforgiving. What kind of man would he be to accept such a sacrifice? What kind of monster would profit from her desperation? Eleanor cleared her throat, her tone carefully neutral. "Well, that's unexpected, but it doesn't alter the medical feasibility. The doctor's notes confirm excellent reproductive health. No complications expected." She adjusted her glasses, as if the revelation were a mere footnote in their transaction. But for Orion, it was a seismic shift. He stared at Layla, his mind reeling as the full weight of her choice settled over him. She wasn't just offering to carry his child. She was offering to sacrifice her innocence, her first intimate experience, in a clinical, invasive procedure for a stranger's benefit. The thought made his chest tighten, a storm of guilt and shame brewing beneath his composed exterior. He'd built his empire on taking companies, resources, opportunities. But this felt different, wrong. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse, "do you understand what this process involves? The medical procedures, the examinations, the intimacy of it all?" Layla's flush deepened, but she didn't look away. "I'm not a child, Mr. Whitmore," she said, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "I understand exactly what's required. The agency explained the in vitro process, the monitoring, everything. I know it's invasive. I know it's personal, but I also know what's at stake." Her voice softened, but the steel beneath it remained. "My mother is all I have. If this is what it takes to save her, I'm prepared." The conviction in her words hit Orion like a wave, pulling him under. She wasn't just prepared. She was resolute, her love for her mother a force that dwarfed the sterile wealth surrounding them. Eleanor shuffled her papers, her discomfort evident in the slight crease of her brow. Well, that clarifies things. We'll need to review the legal documents next. But Orion barely heard her. His gaze was locked on Layla, on the way her hands trembled despite her steady voice, on the way her eyes held a depth of sacrifice he'd never encountered. She was offering something precious, something she'd guarded for 25 years, not for her own gain, but for love. The contrast between her selflessness and his world of calculated deals was stark, blinding. He felt exposed, as if the glass walls of the boardroom had turned inward, reflecting not just the city skyline, but the man he'd become, a man who'd never had to sacrifice anything, who'd never known a love so fierce it demanded everything. As Layla sat there, her dignity unshaken, Orion's heart pounded with a question he couldn't yet voice. How could he be part of something that reduced her gift to a transaction? The silence stretched, heavy with the weight of a revelation that would change everything. The boardroom of Orion Enterprises, with its gleaming glass walls and rosewood table, felt like a cage as Layla Thompson's revelation hung in the air. Her willingness to sacrifice her innocence to save her mother's life had cracked something open in Orion Whitmore, a fracture in the polished armor of a billionaire who had never known true sacrifice. Layla sat across from him, her rich ebony skin catching the sunlight, her worn emerald blazer a quiet testament to her struggles. Her dark eyes held steady, but her hands folded tightly in her lap betrayed a tremor of vulnerability. Orion's mother, Eleanor Whitmore, adjusted her cream silk dress, her silver hair glinting as she maintained her clinical composure. "Miss Thompson," she said, her voice crisp, "your commitment is clear. Let's discuss the timeline for the procedure." But Orion's mind was elsewhere, snagged on Layla's words, on the weight of her desperation and the purity of her love. He leaned forward, his tailored navy suit shifting against his broad shoulders, his green eyes searching Layla's face. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice low, almost rough, "how soon do you need the money for your mother's treatment?" The question was blunt, cutting through the sterile air like a blade. Layla's gaze met his, and for a moment the room seemed to shrink, the city's skyline beyond the windows fading into irrelevance. "The first payment, $100,000, is due in 10 days, she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "If I don't make it, they'll give her spot to someone else." 10 days. The word struck Orion like a physical blow, his chest tightening. That sum was trivial to him, less than he spent on a weekend chartering his yacht, a mere footnote in his quarterly expenses. But for Layla, it was the difference between hope and despair, a lifeline for her mother, Grace, who lay dying of pancreatic cancer. Orion's fingers brushed the edge of his cufflinks, a nervous tick he barely registered. 10 days, he repeated, more to himself than to her. The urgency of her timeline pressed against his conscience, a ticking clock that echoed in the hollows of his heart. He'd built his empire on calculated risks, on seizing opportunities others couldn't see. But this was different. This wasn't a deal to be closed. It was a woman's life, her love, her sacrifice laid bare before him. Eleanor, sensing his hesitation, cleared her throat. "The agency can expedite the medical process," she said, her tone all business. "We could begin the in vitro procedures within the week, assuming all parties are prepared." Her words were practical, but they grated against Orion's nerves, each syllable reducing Layla's sacrifice to a checklist item. Layla nodded, her posture straight despite the exhaustion in her eyes. "I'm prepared," she said softly, but the conviction in her voice carried a weight that made Orion's stomach churn. Prepared to undergo invasive procedures, to surrender her body, her first intimate experience, to a clinical transaction, all for her mother's life. The thought twisted in his gut, a cold sickness rising at the idea of exploiting such desperation. He stood abruptly, moving to the window, the Singapore skyline sprawling below like a glittering chessboard he'd mastered long ago. But this wasn't a game he could win with strategy or wealth. Layla's sacrifice wasn't a pawn to be moved. It was a mirror, reflecting the man he'd become. A man who took, who conquered, but who had never given anything that cost him. Mr. Whitmore? Layla's voice was tentative, pulling him back from the edge of his thoughts. He turned, meeting her gaze, and saw the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Is something wrong? She asked, her fingers tightening in her lap. Orion opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. Everything was wrong. The contract, the procedure, the very idea of reducing her love to a business arrangement. It was all wrong. He glanced at Eleanor, whose sharp eyes watched him with a mix of curiosity and disapproval. Excuse us, Miss Thompson, he said, his voice taut. I need to speak with my mother privately. Confusion flashed across Layla's face, but she nodded, rising with that quiet grace that seemed to defy the room's cold opulence. Of course, she said, stepping toward the door. Should I wait outside? Just a few minutes, Orion replied, his tone softer now, as if to reassure her. She left, closing the glass door softly behind her, leaving a silence that felt like a chasm. Eleanor rounded on him the moment the door clicked shut. What are you doing, Orion? Her voice was sharp, her silver hair catching the light like a crown of authority. She's agreed to the terms. The agency has vetted her. Why are you hesitating? Orion paced, his usual composure fracturing, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Did you hear her, Mother? She's 25, a virgin, sacrificing everything for her mother's life. And we're sitting here, reducing it to a contract, to procedures. His voice rose, edged with a passion he rarely let surface. She's not a commodity. She's a human being, offering something sacred for love, and we're treating it like a line item on a balance sheet. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, but her tone remained cool. She's willing to fulfill the contract. You're offering her a fair deal, $500,000 for services rendered. This is business, Orion. Services rendered? He whirled to face her, his hands slamming against the window, the sound sharp in the quiet room. We're talking about her body, her innocence, her first intimate experience, and you want to call it services rendered? What does that make me, Mother? A man who profits from desperation? Eleanor studied him, her expression softening slightly, a rare crack in her steely facade. You're getting emotional, she said almost gently. Damn right I'm getting emotional, he snapped, his voice low but fierce. She's out there, scared and desperate, willing to give up everything for love. And I'm supposed to sit here and exploit that? What kind of man does that make me? The question hung between them, unanswered, as Orion's chest heaved with the weight of his own words. He moved to the table, pulling out his checkbook from the inner pocket of his suit. His hands were steady, though his heart pounded against his ribs. What are you doing? Eleanor asked, her voice tinged with alarm. What I should have done the moment I heard her story, he said, his pen moving swiftly across the check. He wrote out $200,000, enough to cover Grace's entire treatment, not just the first payment. Tearing the check free, he folded it carefully, his fingers lingering on the paper as if it held the weight of his decision. I'm not exploiting her, Mother. I'm giving her a chance to save her mother without losing herself. Eleanor's eyes widened, a rare flicker of surprise crossing her face. Orion, think about this. You've wanted an heir for years. She's your best option. He looked at her, his gaze steady, almost pitying. My best option isn't to use a desperate woman's love as leverage. My best option is to be the kind of man who protects people like Layla, not the kind who takes from them. He moved toward the door, the check burning in his hand, a decision that felt like the first real choice he'd ever made. The corridors of Mount Elizabeth Hospital were a world apart from the gleaming penthouse of Orion Enterprises, their worn linoleum floors and faint scent of disinfectant, a stark reminder of lives hanging in the balance. Orion Whitmore followed Layla Thompson through the bustling hallway, his tailored navy suit out of place among the harried nurses and flickering fluorescent lights. The $200,000 check in his pocket felt like a talisman, a fragile promise to right a wrong he'd nearly committed. Layla's steps were measured, her emerald blazer catching the dim light as she led him toward her mother's room. Her braided hair swayed slightly, but her shoulders were tense, her dark eyes clouded with worry. She's fragile now, Layla said, her voice low, almost protective. The cancer's taken a lot from her. Promise you'll see her for who she is, not just her illness. Orion's gaze softened, meeting hers. I promise, he said, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised even him. They paused outside room 314, the door's chipped paint a testament to the hospital's budget constraints. Layla's hand hovered over the handle, her breath catching as if bracing for a storm. She doesn't know you're coming, she admitted, her eyes searching his. I wanted to tell her about the treatment first, before explaining you. Orion nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her trust. However you want to handle this, he said, his tone steady despite the churn in his gut. Layla pushed the door open, and they stepped into a cramped room dominated by a hospital bed and a tangle of medical equipment. Grace Thompson lay propped against thin pillows, her frail frame a shadow of the strength Orion saw mirrored in Layla's face. Her dark skin was ashen, her intelligent eyes, echoes of her daughter's, dimmed by exhaustion. Yet when she saw Layla, her face lit up, a spark of warmth piercing the sterile gloom. Baby girl, Grace said, her voice weak but rich with affection. I wasn't expecting you tonight. Layla moved to her mother's bedside, taking her hand with a tenderness that made Orion's chest ache. I have news, Mama, she said, her voice soft but firm. Good news. Grace's gaze shifted to Orion, taking in his expensive suit and the quiet intensity in his green eyes. And who's this? She asked, her tone curious but guarded. Layla squeezed her mother's hand. This is Orion Whitmore. He's helping us. Understanding flickered in Grace's eyes, followed by a shadow of pain. Helping us how, baby? Layla's voice was steady, a practiced lie slipping from her lips. Mr. Whitmore offered me a job at his company. A signing bonus covers the treatment. The experimental therapy, Mama, all of it. Grace's eyes narrowed, her gaze locking onto Orion with a mother's protective instinct. Despite her frailty, there was a fierceness in her expression that made the billionaire feel exposed, as if she could see through his wealth to the man beneath. A job, she said, her voice sharp despite its weakness. And what kind of job comes with a bonus that pays for something like that? Layla started to speak, but Grace held up a trembling hand. Mr. Whitmore, she said, gesturing weakly toward a chair by the window, might I have a word with you, privately? Layla's eyes widened. Mama, it's all right, Orion interrupted, his voice calm but resolute. He moved to the chair, settling across from Grace, while Layla stepped to the far side of the room, her face tight with anxiety. Grace studied him, her eyes missing nothing despite the toll of her illness. Mr. Whitmore, she began, her voice quiet but piercing, I may be sick, but I'm not stupid. Men like you don't hand out bonuses big enough to cover experimental cancer treatments without asking for something in return. What did you want from my daughter? The directness of her question caught Orion off guard, a blade slicing through the careful distance he'd maintained. Here was a woman facing death, her body weakened, but her spirit unbowed, her first concern not her survival, but her daughter's dignity. He leaned forward, his hands clasped, his voice low and honest. Mrs. Thompson, I understand your concern. Originally, I wanted Layla to be a surrogate, to carry my child. The agency arranged it, and she agreed. Grace's face crumpled, a mix of relief and heartbreak, her eyes closing briefly as if to shield herself from the truth. And now, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Orion met her gaze unflinching. Now I want to give her a chance to save you without sacrificing herself. The money is a gift, not a payment. She showed me what love looks like, real love, the kind that gives everything. I couldn't be part of taking that from her. Grace's eyes glistened, tears pooling but not falling. You see her, don't you? She said, her voice softening. Really see her? Orion nodded, his throat tight. She's extraordinary. Her strength, her love for you. It's changed me. Grace's lips curved into a faint smile, the first real warmth he'd seen from her. She's always been that way. Even as a girl, she'd give her lunch to kids who had none, stand up to bullies twice her size, but she's never let anyone take care of her. Orion glanced across the room at Layla, who stood with her arms crossed, watching them with barely contained worry. Maybe it's time she learned, he said softly. Grace's smile deepened, her frail hand reaching for his. Maybe you're the one to teach her." The words landed like a promise, heavy with possibility. Orion felt a shift within him, a realization that this moment, this meeting, wasn't just about saving Grace. It was about seeing Layla, truly seeing her, and understanding the depth of her love. Grace squeezed his hand, her grip weak but resolute. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for the money, but for seeing my baby girl for who she is." Orion's heart swelled, the weight of her gratitude mingling with his resolve. He'd come to this hospital to right a wrong, but he was leaving with something more, a glimpse of a love so fierce it demanded he become a better man. The Orion Enterprises tower stood like a sentinel against the Singapore skyline, its glass facade reflecting the city's restless pulse. Inside, the corner office hummed with a different kind of energy, one that had shifted in the months since Layla Thompson's life-altering meeting with Orion Whitmore. The sterile boardroom where they'd first met was a distant memory, replaced by a space that felt alive with purpose. Layla sat at a sleek mahogany desk, her braided hair pulled into a neat bun, her navy dress a far cry from the worn emerald blazer she'd worn that first day. Papers detailing proposals for the Grace Thompson Foundation were spread before her, each one a lifeline for families facing medical crises. At 25, she transformed from a desperate daughter into the director of a nonprofit that bore her mother's name, funded by Orion's wealth but driven by her heart. Her dark eyes, once shadowed by exhaustion, now sparked with determination, a fire kindled by hope. Orion leaned against the window, his tailored suit framing his lean figure, his green eyes tracing Layla's movements with a quiet intensity. The restless billionaire who had once sought an heir to cement his legacy now found himself captivated by something deeper. A woman whose selflessness had rewritten his understanding of wealth. The foundation, launched 3 months ago, had already helped 17 families, each case a testament to Layla's fierce dedication. She'd thrown herself into the work with the same resolve she'd once reserved for survival, balancing late-night strategy sessions with her new enrollment in business school. Her mother, Grace, was in remission, her pancreatic cancer retreating against the odds, and Layla's dreams, once buried under necessity, were blooming again. But it wasn't just her transformation that held Orion spellbound. It was the way she'd changed him, pulling him from a life of acquisition into one of purpose. Their partnership had begun as a professional necessity, a careful dance of boundaries in the wake of Orion's decision to fund Grace's treatment without exploiting Layla's sacrifice. But the lines between professional and personal had blurred, softened by stolen moments that felt like promises. Late-night talks over coffee in the office had turned into walks along Marina Bay, the city's lights casting a glow on their shared silences. Orion found himself lingering on her laughter, the way her eyes crinkled when she spoke of her mother's recovery, or the children she hoped to help through the foundation. Layla, too, felt the pull, her guarded heart softening under Orion's quiet support, his willingness to listen rather than dictate. Yet both held back, wary of the complexity of their situation. Layla, determined to prove her worth beyond his generosity. Orion, respecting her need to stand on her own. Tonight, the office was bathed in the golden light of dusk, the city sprawling below like a canvas of possibilities. Layla looked up from her proposal, her pen pausing mid-note. "The Lim family's case is urgent," she said, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Their son needs a transplant, but the post-op medications are beyond their reach. We could cover it, $80,000 over 2 years." Orion crossed the room, settling into a chair beside her, his gaze warm but focused. "Approve it," he said simply. "That's what the foundation is for." Layla shook her head, a wry smile tugging at her lips. "You can't just say yes to everything, Orion. We need to be strategic, maximize impact." He grinned, a rare lightness breaking through his usual intensity. "That's why I have you, to make sure my good intentions don't bankrupt us." Her laughter filled the room, a sound that stirred something deep in Orion's chest. He leaned closer, his voice softening. "You're incredible, you know that? The way you've taken this foundation and made it your own." Layla's smile faded, her eyes searching his. "I couldn't have done it without you," she said quietly. "You gave me the chance to save my mother, to build something real." Orion shook his head. You were always real, Layla. I just gave you the tools. You're the one building the future. The air between them thickened, charged with unspoken truths. Layla set her pen down, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her thoughts. My mother said something to me yesterday, she began, her voice low, almost hesitant. She said I've been so afraid of taking advantage of your generosity that I haven't considered what I might be giving you. Orion's heart quickened, his breath catching. And what's that? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla stood, moving to the window, the city's lights reflecting in her dark eyes. You showed me I could be more than my circumstances, she said, turning to face him. You saw me when I was at my lowest, and instead of using me, you protected me. You gave me hope, not just for Mama, but for myself. And she paused, her voice catching, her vulnerability laid bare. I'm falling in love with you, Orion, not for what you've done, but for who you are. The man who listens, who cares, who's trying to be better every day. The confession hung between them, a fragile bridge spanning their different worlds. Orion's chest tightened, a storm of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He stood, closing the distance between them, his green eyes locked on hers. Layla, he said, his voice rough with feeling, you've made me want to be a better man since the moment you walked into that boardroom. I've been falling for you every day since. Your strength, your heart, the way you make the world brighter just by being you. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing hers, a tentative question. She didn't pull away, her touch warm and steady, grounding him. I've never felt this before, he admitted, his voice raw. Not in all my years of chasing wealth or status. You've changed me, Layla, in ways I didn't know I needed. Her eyes glistened, tears catching the light, but her smile was radiant, a beacon in the dusk. She stepped closer, their hands entwining, and the space between them vanished. He kissed her, soft and tentative at first, a question rather than a demand. When she kissed him back, rising on her toes to meet him, it was as if the world realigned, the restless searching that had defined Orion's life falling silent. Her hands rested against his chest and he felt something slot into place, a sense of home he'd never known. When they parted, both breathless, Layla's voice was a whisper. This is crazy, isn't it? Orion smiled, his thumb brushing her cheek. Completely crazy, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. The city lights glittered below, a silent witness to the transformation unfolding in that office. A love born not from wealth, but from the courage to see each other's hearts. The Singapore River shimmered under the evening sky, its surface a mosaic of city lights that danced like stars fallen to earth. Orion Whitmore and Layla Thompson stood on the quay, the air warm and heavy with the scent of water and possibility. The city pulsed around them, a symphony of distant horns and murmured conversations. But for Orion, the world had narrowed to the woman beside him. Layla's navy dress hugged her frame, her braided hair catching the glow of nearby lanterns. Her dark eyes, once shadowed by desperation, now sparkled with a quiet confidence, a transformation that made Orion's heart ache with pride, and something deeper, something he was only beginning to name. Their relationship had evolved in careful steps over the past months, a delicate balance of professional respect and personal longing. Late-night meetings at the Grace Thompson Foundation had bled into walks along Marina Bay, lunches stretching into dinners, and dinners into moments that felt dangerously like love. Yet both had held back, Layla insisting on proving her worth beyond Orion's generosity, and Orion respecting her need to carve her own path. Tonight, the air between them crackled with unspoken truths. They just left a foundation event, a fundraiser that had raised enough to support 10 more families facing medical crises. Layla's speech had been electric, her passion for the cause igniting the room, and Orion had watched, captivated, as she spoke of hope and resilience. Now, as they paused by the river, the city's glow casting shadows across her face, Orion felt a restlessness stir within him, a need to bridge the gap they'd both been circling. You were incredible tonight, he said, his voice low, his green eyes tracing the curve of her smile. Layla laughed softly, brushing a stray braid behind her ear. I was terrified, she admitted, her voice warm with honesty. But seeing those families in the crowd, Knowing we're making a difference, it's worth every nerve. Orion stepped closer, his tailored suit brushing against her as the space between them shrank. You make the difference, Layla, he said, his tone earnest. The foundation, the families, all of it. It's because of you. She shook her head, her smile wry. It's because of us, Orion. Your support, your belief in me. That's what made this possible. Her words hung between them, heavy with gratitude but laced with something more. Something that made Orion's pulse quicken. He'd spent his life chasing control, building an empire on certainty, but with Layla he felt unmoored, alive in a way that terrified and thrilled him. He reached for her hand, his fingers finding hers, warm and steady, a tether in the storm of his emotions. Layla, he said, his voice rough with feeling, you've changed everything for me. I thought I knew what I wanted, an heir, a legacy, but meeting you showed me what I was missing. You've made me want to be better, to be worthy of the woman who walked into my life and turned it upside down. Layla's eyes widened, her breath catching as she searched his face. Orion, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you saying? He took a breath, the weight of the moment pressing against his chest. He'd faced boardrooms and hostile takeovers without flinching, but this was a risk that could break him. I'm saying I love you, he said, the words spilling out, raw and unguarded. I've been falling for you since that first day, and I don't want to keep pretending this is just professional. I want a life with you, Layla. I want everything. Her lips parted, a soft gasp escaping as tears gathered in her dark eyes. This is crazy, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We're so different, Orion. Your world, my world. She gestured helplessly at the city around them, at the invisible lines that separated their lives. Orion shook his head, stepping closer until their hands were entwined, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. You're my world, he said simply. The rest is just noise. He paused, his heart pounding, then dropped to one knee, the keys stone cool against his suit. From his pocket, he pulled a small velvet box, opening it to reveal a simple diamond ring that gleamed in the lantern light. Not ostentatious, but perfect, chosen for her. Marry me, Layla, he said, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. I know it's fast, I know it's complicated, but I don't want to waste another moment without you. I want to build a life together, to face every challenge with you by my side. Layla's hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks as she stared at him. The ring, the man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up. Orion, she said, her voice breaking, I love you too. I was scared to admit it, scared it was just gratitude. But it's you, the man who saw me, who believed in me. Yes, yes, I'll marry you. Her words were a rush, a release, and Orion's heart soared as he slid the ring onto her finger, the fit as natural as their hands entwined. He rose, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her, a deep, fervent kiss that held all the promises they'd been too afraid to voice. Her hands gripped his jacket, pulling him closer, and the city around them faded, the river's shimmer a mere backdrop to the fire between them. When they parted, breathless and laughing, Layla's eyes sparkled with joy and defiance. But no prenup, she said, her voice firm. I'm marrying you for you, Orion, not your wealth. I want everyone to know that. Orion's laughter was warm, his arms tightening around her. You're extraordinary, he said, his voice thick with emotion, and I'm counting on you to keep me grounded. The river flowed on, a silent witness to their vow, a moment where two hearts, once divided by circumstance, chose to build a future together, bound not by wealth, but by love. The garden behind Grace Thompson's new home in Sentosa was a tapestry of jasmine and white roses, their petals glowing under the soft light of fairy lanterns strung between ancient trees. The late afternoon sun cast a golden haze, bathing the small gathering of 30 guests in warmth as they sat on folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. The air was thick with the scent of blooms and the quiet hum of anticipation, a sacred pause before the moment that would bind two souls. Layla Thompson stood at the end of a makeshift aisle, radiant in a simple white dress that clung to her frame like a whispered promise. Her braided hair fell loose around her shoulders, framing her rich ebony skin, and she carried a bouquet of roses from her mother's garden, their delicate fragrance a tribute to Grace's resilience. Orion Whitmore waited beneath an arch of flowers, his tailored charcoal suit accentuating his lean frame, his green eyes fixed on Layla with an intensity that made the world fall away. At 39, he stood not as a billionaire commanding an empire, but as a man stripped bare by love, his heart laid open for the woman who had changed him. The guests, family, and close friends watched in reverent silence, their faces a mosaic of joy and quiet awe. Grace sat in the front row, her frail frame now vibrant with health, her dark eyes glistening as she watched her daughter approach. The experimental treatment, funded by Orion's gift, had worked miracles, transforming a woman once given months to live into one who radiated life. The minister, a soft-spoken man with a voice like warm honey, raised his hands. "Dearly beloved," he began, but Orion barely heard him, his gaze locked on Layla. She moved with a grace that seemed to defy the weight of her past, her steps steady, her smile a beacon of joy that made his breath catch. Her dark eyes met his, and in them he saw not just love but a shared journey, a path forged from sacrifice and choice, leading to this moment. As Layla reached him, Orion took her hands, marveling at how perfectly they fit together, her calloused palms a testament to her strength, his own steady despite the nervous thrum in his chest. The minister's voice wove through the air, a gentle thread binding the gathering. "The couple has written their vows," he announced, stepping back to give them the stage. Orion cleared his throat, his heart pounding as he faced Layla, the weight of his words heavier than any deal he'd ever closed. "Layla," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "when you walked into my life, I thought I knew what wealth was. Money, power, control. But you showed me what true wealth looks like. It's love that gives everything, that sacrifices without hesitation. You walked into that boardroom offering your heart for your mother's life, and in doing so, you saved mine." His voice wavered, but he pressed on, his grip tightening on her hands. "You showed me that real wealth is having someone who believes in you when you doubt yourself, who challenges you to be better than you thought possible. You've made me want to be a man worthy of your love, and I promise you today, in front of everyone we hold dear, that I will spend every day of our lives cherishing your dreams as fiercely as you've cherished mine. I promise to stand by you, to protect the heart you've trusted me with, and to love you not just for who you are, but for who you inspire me to be." Tears glistened in Layla's eyes, but her smile was radiant, a sun breaking through clouds. The guests leaned forward, some dabbing at their eyes, caught in the raw honesty of his words. Layla took a breath, her voice clear and strong as she began her vows. "Orion," she said, her eyes never leaving his, "when I was a girl, my mother taught me that there are two kinds of people, those who see problems and those who see possibilities. You saw me at my lowest, when I was ready to give up everything, and instead of taking advantage, you chose to be my possibility. You could have seen my desperation as a weakness, but you saw it as a strength. You could have treated our foundation as a tax write-off, but you made it your passion." Her voice softened, growing intimate, as if they were alone in the garden. "You could have seen me as someone to rescue, but instead, you saw me as someone worth believing in. You gave me the chance to save myself, and then you loved me for the woman I chose to become." She lifted his hands to her lips, pressing a soft kiss to his knuckles, a gesture that sent a shiver down his spine. "So I promise you today," she continued, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks, "that I will never stop fighting to deserve the faith you've placed in me. I promise to challenge you to be your best self, as you've challenged me. And I promise to love you not for what you've given me, but for the man you've chosen to be. A man who sees hearts, not just opportunities." The garden seemed to hold its breath, the guests captivated by the raw power of her words, the love that bound them like a vow etched in stone. The minister's voice returned, gentle but resonant. "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." Orion leaned in, his kiss gentle and reverent, a seal on the promises they'd made. Layla met him, her hands rising to his face, and the world melted away. the guests, the garden, the city beyond, leaving only the truth of their bond. As they pulled apart, their foreheads touching, laughter bubbled between them, a shared joy that felt like a beginning. The guests erupted in applause, Grace's beaming smile a beacon from the front row, her health a living testament to the love that had brought them here. Orion and Layla turned to face their loved ones, hands entwined, their faces glowing with a happiness that transcended wealth. The jasmine arch framed them like a halo, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the garden, Orion felt a certainty he'd never known. This was no transaction, no empire built on taking. This was a life built on giving, on choosing love over fear. Layla squeezed his hand, her smile a silent vow to face the future together, and Orion knew, with every fiber of his being, that he'd found his true legacy. Not in an heir, but in the woman who had taught him what it meant to love. The garden behind Grace Thompson's Sentosa home glowed under a velvet sky, its jasmine and rose bushes now bathed in the soft twinkle of fairy lights. The wedding festivities had wound down, leaving only the hum of cicadas and the rustle of leaves in the warm night air. Orion Whitmore and Layla Thompson swayed gently on a small dance floor, the music from a modest speaker system weaving a quiet spell around them. Layla's white dress shimmered faintly, her braided hair catching the starlight, while Orion's charcoal suit, now slightly rumpled, clung to his lean frame. Their first anniversary as husband and wife felt like a milestone carved from dreams, a testament to a journey that had transformed them both. The Grace Thompson Foundation, now a beacon of hope for over 150 families, thrived under Layla's leadership, its mission to ease medical burdens fueled by her passion and Orion's resources. Yet tonight, as they danced, it was the intimacy of their shared purpose that held them close, not the weight of their achievements. Layla rested her head against Orion's shoulder, her dark eyes reflecting the fairy lights like constellations. "No regrets?" she murmured, her voice a soft tease that carried the weight of their shared history. Orion's lips curved into a smile, his green eyes warm as he tightened his arm around her waist. "Only one," he said, his voice low, rich with feeling. She pulled back slightly, her brow arching with playful concern. "What's that?" He spun her gently, the movement drawing a laugh from her lips. "That I didn't find you sooner," he said, his gaze locking onto hers, earnest and unguarded. Layla's laughter rang out, bright and joyful, a sound that seemed to light the garden from within. "Well," she said, her tone mock serious, "I needed those years to become someone worth finding." Orion shook his head, pulling her closer. "You were always worth finding, Layla. You just needed the chance to shine." The truth of his words hung between them, a quiet acknowledgement of the path they'd traveled. Layla had enrolled in business school, balancing late-night study sessions with her work at the foundation, her ambition to run it with precision matched only by her compassion. Orion, once driven by the relentless pursuit of wealth, had found a new purpose in giving, his empire now a tool to uplift rather than dominate. The foundation's success, helping families like the Lims, whose son's transplant was now fully funded, or the Tans, whose daughter's cancer treatment was covered, was a testament to their shared vision. But it was the personal moments, the quiet victories, that bound them most tightly. Orion's weekly breakfast with Grace, where he listened to her stories of Layla's childhood, had become a ritual, a bridge between his world and theirs. Grace, now cancer-free, had become a surrogate grandmother to neighborhood children, her home a haven of warmth and roses. As they danced, Grace approached, her steps light despite the faint fragility that lingered from her illness. She carried a basket of rose centerpieces she'd crafted for the wedding, her dark eyes gleaming with health and pride. "You two," she said, her voice warm with affection, "are making it hard for an old woman to keep up with all this love." Layla laughed, stepping out of Orion's arms to embrace her mother. "Thank you, Mama," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for teaching me what strength looks like, for showing me how to recognize love when I found it." Grace smoothed Layla's hair, a gesture from childhood that carried a lifetime of love. "Baby girl," she said, her eyes glistening, "you gave me the greatest gift. You let me live to see you happy, to dance at your wedding, To know the man who loves you the way you deserve? Grace turned to Orion, her gaze steady and warm. And you, son, she said, the word landing like a blessing in Orion's chest. You gave me my daughter's happiness. There's no greater gift you could have given me. Orion's throat tightened, the weight of her words settling deep. Thank you for raising her to be who she is, he replied, his voice rough with emotion. She's the reason I'm the man I am today. Grace smiled, pulling him into a brief, fierce hug before stepping back to gather her roses, leaving the couple alone in the garden's glow. Layla took Orion's hand, her fingers intertwining with his as they stood beneath the stars. What are you thinking about? She asked, noticing the contemplative look in his eyes. He gazed at her, the woman who had walked into his life, offering everything for love, and had given him a purpose beyond wealth. I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you stepped out of that taxi and into my life, he said, his voice soft but fervent. You showed me what matters. Love, giving, building something bigger than myself. Layla's smile was radiant, her eyes shimmering with tears. I'm grateful you were decent enough to change your mind about what you wanted from me, she said, her tone teasing, but her gaze deep with meaning. Best decision I ever made, Orion replied, dipping her gently, drawing another laugh from her lips. Well, second best. She raised an eyebrow. What's the best? He grinned, pulling her close. Asking you to marry me. The garden seemed to hold its breath, the fairy lights casting a soft halo around them. Their journey from a desperate transaction to a love that redefined wealth had built a legacy not of assets, but of compassion. As they stood together, the scent of roses mingling with the night air, Orion felt a sense of completion he'd never known. He'd started this seeking an heir, but found a partner who made him want to be worthy of her love, a purpose that extended beyond his desires, and a family bound by choice. Layla leaned into him, her warmth a promise of tomorrows yet to come. And Orion knew that true wealth was not what he could accumulate, but what he could give, his heart, his trust, and a life built hand in hand with the woman who had changed everything. What did you think of Orion and Layla's journey from a transaction born of desperation to a love that redefined wealth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. How has love transformed your own perspective? Or what would you sacrifice for someone you cherish? Your stories inspire us, so don't hold back. Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt tale of compassion and connection. Your support means the world. Subscribe to our channel to catch the next captivating story, because we can't wait to share more moments that touch the heart. Until next time, keep believing in the power of love to change everything.